Good evening.
Good evening.
Welcome. I'm Beth Walker with the Pasadena Public Library, and we are delighted to see you all here. This is a wonderful crowd to come out on this rainy night. But we're excited that you're here with us for this special program with Dr. Michelle Alexander. I want to thank those who have co-sponsored this event with us this evening. They are listed on your program, and a special thank you to all of them. Also, the number of individuals who have contributed their time and funds to help make this program a possibility tonight. Thank you, all of you. I want to acknowledge a few people who are here in the audience this evening. With us is Mayor Bill Bogard. Also with us this evening is Terry Hatter Jr. with the United States District Court, Central District of California. And I hope I'm not inadvertently overlooking anyone, but if I am, I apologize, and welcome to everyone. This evening is part of the library's One City, One Story program, which is a community-wide reading program that encourages all of Pasadena to read and discuss the same book. And this is a concept that was begun in Seattle, Washington, a number of years ago, and has spread to communities throughout the country. And since 2002, Pasadena has been hosting a One City, One Story. It's a wonderful idea of bringing together community in a single conversation, lots of different perspectives and views, and it's one that we've been very happy to present each year. This year we're featuring the book Mudbound by Hillary Jordan, and we've been partnering with a number of organizations in the community to present programs throughout this month of March. We've been partnering with the Pasadena City College and Caltech, Huntington Hospital, Pasadena Museum of Art, and a number of other organizations. This coming Saturday, and I think we had something up on the screen earlier, the author, Hillary Jordan, will be here in Pasadena. She'll be in conversation with our library director, Jan Sanders, at the Pasadena Convention Center beginning at 3 o'clock. So we hope you'll join us for that. That program, as well as all of our programs this month, are featured in our One City, One Story brochure. So please check that out if you haven't seen it. It's available in paper as well as on the library's website at pasadenapubliclibrary.net. Also, copies of the book Mudbound are available for checkout here at the library, as well as at Central, as well as at all of our branch libraries as well. And you can also follow us this year, One City, One Story, on a number of social media. We're on YouTube and Flickr and Facebook, Meetup, Gowalla, and Twitter. In fact, this evening I think we're tweeting this program. So those who can be with us virtually, we're happy to have you as well. And also this evening's program is being videotaped and will be available on the library's webpage. So once again, I thank you for being here. We're really delighted, and I hope you do enjoy this evening's program. And next, I'd like to introduce our manager for La Pintoresca Branch Library, who has been so instrumental in bringing this program to us this evening, Diane Walker.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you. Welcome to Pasadena Public Library. This is the Central Branch. My name, of course, is Diane Walker, and I'm the branch manager of La Pintoresca and Villa Park Library. I want to thank my staff, the ad hoc committee, the Central Library staff, and every individual who has contributed to making this program possible. There's a coin saying that it takes a village. Well, it takes a community, and we're all together today, so this is absolutely wonderful. I want to thank all of you for coming out again in this rain. In a moment, I will take great pleasure in introducing to you the celebrated author, and deservingly so, of the new Jim Crow, the 2011 NAACP Image Award winner, Michelle Alexander. First, I ask you to consider what we have witnessed in the last few years, the 2009 inauguration of the first African-American President, Barack Obama, and the appointment of our first Hispanic Supreme Court Justice, Sonia Sotomayor. And there are more I could list. Clearly, this and other notable events are evidence of progress made in America's ongoing struggle to live out the true meaning of its creed. We view this progress in light of our past, our present, and our hope for the future. While we may cautiously bask in the warm afterglow of what should be givens with respect to truly equal opportunity, equal justice, and equal chance for happiness, we must remain on guard. It is true that in this so-called post-civil rights era, there are signals of progression over digression, but the battles continue. In many ways, opponents of political and human equality have donned new robes, adopted new and perhaps even more insidious tactics to further discrimination and prejudice. All people of goodwill must remain vigilant, and the new Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander, intently asks us to not be misled by these positive signals. She calls upon each individual to think critically, examine meticulously, and to start to observe the ways in which race distinctions continue to exist in our society. Dr. Michelle Alexander is a highly acclaimed civil rights lawyer, advocate, and legal scholar who currently holds a joint appointment at Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity and the Moritz College of Law at The Ohio State University. Prior to joining the Kirwan Institute, Dr. Alexander was an associate professor of law at Stanford Law School, where she directed the civil rights clinics. In 2005, she won a Soros Justice Fellowship, which supported the writing of her first book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. The book has received rave reviews and has been featured in national radio and television media outlets. For several years, she served as the director of the Racial Justice Project for the ACLU of Northern California, where she helped to lead a national campaign against racial profiling by law enforcement. While an associate at Serpenstein, Goldstein, Dimchak, and Baller, she specialized in plaintiff side class action lawsuits alleging race and gender discrimination. Alexander is a graduate of Stanford Law School and Vanderbilt University. Following law school, she clerked for Justice Harry Blackmun of the United States Supreme Court and for Chief Judge Abner Mikvuk on the United States Court of Appeals for the D.C. District. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my singular honor to present to you Dr. Michelle Alexander.
Thank you so much for having me. Can everyone hear me? I don't have a booming voice, so I want to make sure I'm heard. And you know, I so appreciate the invitation to come here to Pasadena. When I wrote the book, it was my greatest hope and prayer that people would actually be open to hearing the message of the book. So to have you all here today is incredibly gratifying and leaves me with great hope that the changes that are so desperately needed today are coming. Well, I'd like to dedicate my talk today to the memory of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. I find it difficult to overstate the contribution that Dr. King has made to my own understanding of the core spiritual truths that underlie all striving for racial justice. His life's work and his vision for justice, his unapologetic radicalism in the face of injustice offers for me a model of what truly inspired social justice advocacy can look like. But I'm not going to spend my time here tonight merely singing his praises or telling you all of the ways in which we're supposedly so much better off than in the year of his passing. If there's one principle that Dr. King demonstrated as steadfastly as his commitment to nonviolence, it was his commitment to telling the truth, the whole truth about matters of race. As he put it quite bluntly, just months before his death, he said, quote, "I do not see how we will ever solve the turbulent problem of race confronting our nation until there is an honest confrontation with it, and a willing search for the truth, and a willingness to admit the truth when we discover it." So in Dr. King's honor today, I'm going to do my best to tell the truth about race in America. It's a truth that most Americans will deny, just as they once denied the truth about slavery and Jim Crow. But it is the truth nonetheless. And the truth is this: we as a nation have taken a wrong turn in the stride toward freedom. We have betrayed Dr. King's dream. A vast new system of racial and social control has emerged from the ashes of slavery and Jim Crow. It is a system that shuttles our children from underfunded schools to brand new high-tech prisons. This system of mass incarceration, traps poor people, overwhelmingly poor people of color, into a permanent second-class status nearly as effectively as earlier systems of racial and social control. It is the moral equivalent of Jim Crow. Now, there was a time when I thought talk like this was counterproductive. There was a time when I resisted comparisons between mass incarceration and Jim Crow, or mass incarceration and slavery. And I actually thought people who made those kinds of comparisons were doing more harm than good to efforts to reform the criminal justice system and achieve greater racial equality in the United States. In fact, the first time I encountered the idea that our criminal justice system might be functioning something like a caste system, I rejected the idea out of hand. I was rushing to catch the bus in Oakland, California, and this bright orange poster stapled to a telephone pole caught my eye. And on it, in large bold print, it said, "The drug war is the new Jim Crow." And I remember pausing for a minute, scanning the text of the flyer, and I saw some, small radical community group was organizing, or going to be holding a meeting in a community church a few blocks away, and they were organizing to protest the 3 strikes law in California, racial profiling, police brutality, the expansion of the prison system in California. And I remember thinking to myself, yeah, the criminal justice system is racist in a lot of ways, but it doesn't help to make such absurd comparisons to Jim Crow. People just think you're crazy. And then I crossed the street, hopped on the bus, on my way to my new job as director of the Racial Justice Project for the ACLU. Well, when I began my work at the ACLU, I assumed that our criminal justice system had problems of racial bias, much in the same way that all of our institutions in society are infected to some degree or another with problems associated with conscious and unconscious bias and stereotyping. I had been working as a civil rights lawyer litigating, plaintiff side employment discrimination cases, large class action suits against Fortune 500 companies like Home Depot, suing them for race and gender discrimination in employment. And I thought to myself, I'm just going to take the tools that I had applied in the employment discrimination context and apply them to criminal justice reform, and work with others to root out racial bias whenever and wherever it might rear its ugly head in the criminal justice system. But by the time I left the ACLU, I had come to realize that I was wrong about the criminal justice system. It's not just another institution in our society infected with bias, but a different beast entirely. And the activists who posted the sign on the telephone pole weren't crazy, nor were the smattering of lawyers and activists around the country that were beginning to connect the dots between mass incarceration and earlier forms of social and racial control. So really, quite belatedly, I came to see that mass incarceration really had emerged as a stunningly comprehensive and well-disguised system of control analogous to Jim Crow. I state my basic conclusion in the introduction, where I write, "What has changed since the collapse of Jim Crow has less to do with the basic structure of our society than the language we use to justify it. In the era of colorblindness, it is no longer socially permissible to use race explicitly as a justification for discrimination, exclusion, and social contempt." So we don't. Rather than rely on race, we use our criminal justice system to label people of color criminals and then engage in all the practices we supposedly left behind. Today, it is perfectly legal to discriminate against criminals in nearly all the ways in which it was once legal to discriminate against African Americans. Once you're labeled a felon, the old forms of discrimination, employment discrimination, housing discrimination, denial of the right to vote, exclusion from jury service, suddenly legal. As a criminal, you have scarcely more rights and arguably less respect than a black man living in Alabama at the height of Jim Crow. We have not ended racial caste in America, we have merely redesigned it. But like I said, I reached this conclusion reluctantly. It was only after years of working on issues of racial profiling, police brutality, investigating patterns of drug law enforcement, and attempting to assist people released from prison, quote unquote, re-enter into a society that never seemed to have much use for them in the first place, that I had a series of experiences that began what I call my awakening. I began to awaken to a racial reality that is so obvious to me now that what seems odd in retrospect is that I was blind to it for so long. Here are a few of the facts I uncovered in the course of my work and research that I describe in the book. More African American adults are under correctional control today, in prison or jail, on probation or parole, than were enslaved in 1850, a decade before the Civil War began. In 2004, more black men were disenfranchised than in 1870, the year the 15th Amendment was ratified, prohibiting laws that deny the right to vote on the basis of race. Now, during the Jim Crow era, of course, poll taxes and literacy tests operated to keep black folks from the polls. Well, today, felon disenfranchisement laws accomplish what poll taxes and literacy tests ultimately could not. A black child born today has less of a chance of being raised by both parents than a black child born during slavery. This is due in large part to the mass incarceration of black men. There is an interesting article published about this in The Economist magazine, of all places, entitled, "How the Mass Incarceration of Black Men Harms Black Women." And in the article, it described how the majority of black women in the United States are unmarried, including about 70% of black professional women, and that this is due largely to the mass incarceration of black men, which takes them out of the dating pool at the years they would be most likely to commit to a partner or to a family. But then what's worse is that by branding them criminals and felons, they're rendered permanently unemployable for the most part in a legal job market, virtually assuring that most of them will cycle in and out of prison for the rest of their lives. In this way, mass incarceration has decimated black families to a degree comparable to slavery. In some major urban areas, more than half of working-age African American men have criminal records and are thus subject to legalized discrimination for the rest of their lives. In fact, in the Chicago area, it was reported in 2002 that in the Chicago area, if you take into account prisoners who are excluded from poverty statistics and unemployment statistics, they're just not even counted, as though they don't even exist, thus masking the severity of racial inequality in the United States. I mean, in fact, the black unemployment rate today, the official black unemployment rate today, I don't know what it is off the top of my head, but it's bad. You can add 15 to 24 percentage points to that figure to calculate the true unemployment rate for black men once you count all the men behind bars. But like I said, in 2002, it was reported that if you take into account prisoners, nearly 80% of working-age African American men have criminal records and are thus subject to legalized discrimination for the rest of their lives. Now, these men are part of a growing undercaste, not class, caste, a group of people defined largely by race who are relegated to a permanent second-class status by law. Now, I find that when I tell people that I think mass incarceration is like a new Jim Crow or a new caste system, people usually react with this, shock, disbelief. They say, "How can you say that? Just look at Barack Obama. Just look at Oprah Winfrey. Just look at Condoleezza Rice. Just look at Colin Powell." And the list goes on of high-profile, visible, wealthy, powerful African Americans who've made it as proof that nothing like a caste system could possibly exist in the United States today. But I have to remind folks that no caste system in the United States has ever governed all African Americans. There have always been free blacks and black success stories, even during slavery and Jim Crow. During slavery, there were some black slave owners, not many, but some. And during Jim Crow, there were some black lawyers, black doctors, not many, but some. Now, the extraordinary nature of individual black achievement in formerly white domains today certainly suggests that the old Jim Crow system is dead, but it doesn't necessarily mean the end of racial caste. If history is any guide, it may have just taken a different form. I think any honest observer of American racial history has to acknowledge that the rules and reasons the legal system employs for enforcing status relations of any kind, they evolve and they change as they're challenged. In the first chapter of the book, I described what I call the cyclical rebirth of racial caste in America. Since our nation's founding, African Americans have repeatedly been controlled through institutions like slavery and Jim Crow, which appear to die, but then are reborn in new form, tailored to the needs and constraints of the time. For example, following the Civil War, a new institution emerged to replace slavery, known as convict leasing. In the years following the Civil War, African American men were arrested en masse. It was our nation's first prison boom. African American men were arrested for extremely minor crimes like loitering and vagrancy. They were sent to prison and then leased to plantations, sometimes the very plantations they had been freed from, or their parents had been freed from. Leased to plantations, and the idea was they were expected to earn their freedom. But the catch was they could never earn enough to pay back the plantation owner the cost of their food or shelter or clothing to the plantation owner's satisfaction, and so they were effectively re-enslaved, sometimes for the rest of their lives. Douglas Blackman has written a wonderful book about this called Slavery by Another Name, about the rebirth of slavery in the South following the Civil War. Well, I believe our criminal justice system has been used once again in a manner that effectively recreates caste in America. Now, I'm sure there's more than a few people who might be thinking, well, what is she talking about? Our criminal justice system isn't a caste system, it's a system of crime control. And if black people would just stop committing so many crimes, then they wouldn't have to worry about going to prison and being stripped of their basic civil and human rights. But herein lies the biggest myth about mass incarceration, that it has been driven by crime or crime rates. It's not true. It's not true. In less than 30 years, our prison population quintupled, not doubled or tripled, quintupled. We went from a prison population of about 300,000 to well over 2 million. We now have the highest rate of incarceration in the world, dwarfing even highly repressive regimes like Russia or China or Iran. We have built a penal system unprecedented in world history. But as staggering as all of that is, it actually obscures the crisis in poor communities of color. Some sociologists have actually argued that we should stop using the term mass incarceration, because it implies that this is a phenomenon that's affecting everybody, when in fact, mass incarceration is affecting a relatively small segment of the US population. But within that slice, they've come for nearly everybody. You know, in Washington, D.C., it was reported several years ago that 4 out of 5 young black men, and nearly all those in the poorest neighborhoods, could expect to serve time in prison. You know, rates of incarceration nearly as shocking can be found in other poor communities of color across America. So what accounts for the mass imprisonment of black men? It's not crime rates. Not crime rates. Crime rates have fluctuated over the past 30 years. Gone up, gone down. Today, as bad as they are in many parts of the country, are actually at historical lows. But incarceration rates over those 3 decades soared. Most criminologists, you know, and sociologists today will acknowledge that crime rates and incarceration rates in the United States have moved independently of one another. Incarceration rates, especially black incarceration rates, have soared regardless of whether crime was going up or down in any given community or the nation as a whole. So what explains the sudden, extraordinary explosion in incarceration, if not crime rates? Well, turns out that the activists who posted the sign on that telephone pole were right. The war on drugs and the Get Tough movement, the wave of punitiveness that washed over the United States. In fact, drug convictions alone, just drug convictions alone, accounted for about 2/3 of the increase in the federal system and more than half of the increase in the state system between 1985 and 2000, the period of the most dramatic expansion of our prison system. Drug convictions have increased more than 1,000% since the drug war began. I mean, to get a sense of how large a contribution the drug war has made to mass incarceration, consider this. There are more people in prison and jail today just for drug offenses than were incarcerated for all reasons in 1980. Now, most Americans violate drug laws in their lifetime. Most do. But the enemy in this war has been racially defined. The drug war, not by accident, has been waged almost exclusively in poor communities of color, even though studies have now shown for decades that people of color are actually no more likely to use or sell illegal drugs than whites, or sell. Now that defies our basic racial stereotype of who a drug dealer is. You know, picture a drug dealer in your mind and you picture some black kid standing on the street corner with his pants sagging. And plenty of drug dealing happens in the hood, but it happens everywhere else in America as well. A white kid living in rural Kansas or Oklahoma doesn't drive to the hood to get their marijuana or their meth or their cocaine. No. They get it from someone most likely of their own race down the road. You know, drug dealing happens in every community, on every college campus and university, but the drug war has been waged almost exclusively in poor communities of color. In fact, where significant differences in the data can be found, frequently suggest that white youth are more likely to engage in illegal drug dealing than black youth. But that's not what you would guess by taking a peek inside our nation's prisons and jails, which are overflowing with black and brown drug offenders. In fact, in some states, 80 to 90% of all drug offenders sent to prison have been African American. Now, many people tell me when they see the data, yeah, that's bad. But it still makes sense for us to wage the drug war in poor communities of color because that's where the violent offenders are. That's where the drug kingpins are. It makes sense for us to wage the drug war there because of the violence in those communities, and that's what the drug war is all about. In fact, many people seem to believe that the war on drugs was declared in response to the emergence of crack cocaine in inner city communities and the related violence. It's not true. President Ronald Reagan officially declared his drug war in 1982 at a time when drug crime was actually on the decline, not on the rise. It was before, not after, crack began to ravage inner city communities and become a media sensation. President Richard Nixon was the first to coin the term a war on drugs, but it was President Ronald Reagan who turned that rhetorical war into a literal one. And at the time he did so, drug crime was on the decline and not much of a public concern. So why would Reagan declare a drug war at a time drug crime is on the decline, not on the rise? Well, numerous historians and political scientists have now documented that the war on drugs was part and parcel of a grand Republican Party strategy known as the Southern Strategy of using racially coded get tough appeals on issues of crime and welfare to appeal to poor and working class whites, particularly in the South, who felt anxious about, threatened by, resentful of many of the gains of African Americans in the civil rights movement. You know, poor and working class whites really had their world rocked by the civil rights movement. You know, wealthy whites, they could send their kids to private schools, give their kids all of the advantages that wealth had to offer. But poor and working class whites were faced with a social demotion. It was their kids who were potentially subject to desegregation and busing orders that might require them to be bused across town to a school they believed was inferior. It was those folks and their children who were going to be forced to compete on equal terms for the first time for scarce jobs with this whole group of people they had been taught their whole lives to believe were inferior to them. And then to make matters worse, affirmative action policies created the impression that black folks were now leapfrogging over them on the way to Harvard or Yale and to fancy jobs. And this reality, this anxiety, created a lot of fear, resentment, and an enormous political opportunity. Pollsters and political strategists found that thinly veiled promises to get tough on them, a group of people not so subtly defined by a race, be highly effective in flipping the South from blue to red. In the words of H.R. Haldeman, President Richard Nixon's former chief of staff, he described Nixon's Southern strategy in this way. He said, quote, "The whole problem is really the blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this while not appearing to," end quote. Well, they did. And a couple years after the drug war was announced, crack really began to ravage inner city communities. And the Reagan administration actually seized on this development with glee, actually hiring staff whose job it was to publicize inner city crack babies, crack dealers, the so-called crack whores, feed these stories to the media in the hopes of making crack a media sensation, bolstering public support for a war they had already declared, and persuading Congress to devote millions more dollars to it. And the plan worked like a charm. Almost overnight, our television sets were saturated with images of black and brown drug dealers and crack babies and crack whores. And a wave of punitiveness swept over the United States as legislators started competing with each other to try to prove who could be tougher. And harsh sentences for minor drug crimes sailed through Congress and state legislatures, sentences harsher than those received by murderers in some other Western democracies. And almost immediately, Democrats began competing with Republicans to prove they could be even tougher on them than their Republican counterparts. And so it was President Bill Clinton who escalated the drug war far beyond what his Republican predecessors even dreamed possible. It was the Clinton administration that championed laws banning drug offenders from federal financial aid for schooling when they're released from prison, banning drug offenders by federal law even from food stamps for the rest of their lives, banning drug offenders and people with criminal records from public housing. To a large extent, it was the Clinton administration, a Democratic administration, that was responsible for many of the laws that form the basic architecture of this new caste system. They were championed by a Democratic administration desperate to win back those so-called white swing voters that had defected from the Democratic Party, the Reagan Democrats. And many black politicians went along for the ride, swept up in the media hysteria around crack, and many of them genuinely fearful about the violence in poor communities, began calling for get tough measures as well and supporting them, and found themselves complicit in the emergence of a vast new caste system. But still, people say, as bad as that is, we still need a drug war in those communities, those poor communities, to deal with the violent offenders or the drug kingpins. But what folks don't realize is that this drug war has never been focused primarily on rooting out the most violent offenders or the drug kingpins. Federal funding, specialized federal funding for drug law enforcement has flowed to those state and local law enforcement agencies that have boosted the sheer numbers of drug arrests. It became a numbers game. Law enforcement began being rewarded in cash for the sheer numbers of people that were swept in for drug offenses. And drug forfeiture laws gave law enforcement the authority to keep, for their own use, up to 80% of the cash, cars, homes of people suspected of drug offenses, giving law enforcement a direct monetary interest in the profitability of the drug war and the longevity of the drug war as it became a funding stream for their agencies. And the results are predictable. Police officers began sweeping neighborhoods for the so-called low-hanging fruit, stopping, searching, frisking, tossing folks in these stop and frisk operations, pulling cars over, searching them in the search for drugs, all in an attempt to boost their numbers. In 2005, for example, 4 out of 5 drug arrests, possession, only 1 out of 5 were for sales. That same year, most people in state prison for drug offenses had no history of violence or significant selling activity. And in the 1990s, the Clinton years, the period of the greatest escalation of the drug war, nearly 80% of the increase in drug arrests were for marijuana possession, a drug less harmful than alcohol or tobacco, and at least, if not more prevalent, in middle-class white communities and on college campuses and universities as it is in the hood. But by waging the drug war almost exclusively in poor communities of color, a vast new racial undercast was created in a remarkably short period of time. Now, where was the U.S. Supreme Court during all of this? Well, after the drug war was declared, the U.S. Supreme Court committed itself to eviscerating Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable searches and seizures. You know, once upon a time, it wasn't normal for the police to fan out into communities, stopping, frisking, searching, interrogating folks on the street with no evidence of any criminal activity. But the U.S. Supreme Court gave the police license to do so by ruling that they could stop and search anybody just about anywhere as long as they get consent. Now, what's consent? Police officer walks up to a 17-year-old kid on the sidewalk with one hand on his gun and says, "Son, may I look in your bag? You put your arms up so I can frisk you?" And the kid goes, "Yeah." That's consent. Fourth Amendment no longer applies to that highly consensual interaction. That's what makes it possible for police to fan out in these neighborhoods, stopping and searching people at random without any evidence of criminal activity. And then to make matters worse, the U.S. Supreme Court has closed the courthouse doors to claims of racial bias at every stage of the criminal justice process, from stops and searches to plea bargaining and sentencing. In a series of cases beginning with McCleskey versus Kemp and Armstrong versus the United States, the court has ruled that no matter how severe the racial disparities, no matter how overwhelming the statistical evidence might be, unless you can offer proof of conscious intentional bias on the part of a law enforcement official, tantamount to an admission, you can't even state a claim for discrimination in the criminal justice system. Now, how often do you think police officers say, yeah, Your Honor, the reason I stopped him was, well, he was black? Or, a prosecutor says, well, yeah, Your Honor, I would have given him a better plea deal. I thought about it, but he was black, so didn't give it to him. Most law enforcement officials, like the rest of us, know better than to state our racial biases out loud. And so many of the biases and stereotypes that drive and influence police decision-making operate on such an unconscious level that many officers might not even be aware or conscious of their biases or capable of articulating them if they tried. An officer who sees a young black kid moseying down the street may think, oh, let me jump out of the car and talk to him for a minute and see if I can search him. And the thought would never cross their mind if they saw a white kid walking down the street in their neighborhood. Now, that officer may not be intending any harm and may actually believe that he's trying to do a good job by aggressively policing the community. But that thought process, he looks like a criminal, he looks like he's up to no, I better check him out, leads to enormous racial disparities and makes it possible for millions of people of color to be swept into the system just because of who they are. Now, I recognize time's running a little short and I want to leave plenty of time for question and answer, but I want to just identify a few of the most obvious parallels between mass incarceration and Jim Crow. Think about some of these rules and laws that apply to people branded felons today. Ask yourself if they remind you of a bygone era. Well, the first, most obvious, is denial of the right to vote. 48 states and the District of Columbia deny prisoners the right to vote. And here in the United States, we kind of shrug our shoulders at that, like, oh, well, yeah, they're prisoners, so they don't get to vote. Well, in other Western democracies, many other Western democracies, prisoners vote. Prisoners vote. And in fact, in some Western democracies, there's voting drives in prison. The idea that you just forfeit your citizenship because, you committed some crime is unheard of in those countries. But here in the United States, we accept that as a matter of routine, and then we also strip people of the right to vote once they're released from prison for a period of years or even possibly the rest of their lives. In a few states, 1 in 4 black men are temporarily or permanently disenfranchised as a result of felon disenfranchisement laws. Nationwide, the figure is around 1 in 7 or 1 in 8. Exclusion from jury service. One hallmark of the old Jim Crow were the all-white juries, particularly in the South, the automatic exclusion of blacks from juries. Well, today, all-white juries have been having a roaring comeback, including in areas that are actually quite diverse. Why? Well, because if you've been convicted of a felony, you're deemed ineligible for jury service for the rest of your life. And then if you've ever had a negative experience with law enforcement, you can be struck from a jury for cause. Now, good luck finding many folks of color, poor communities of color, have not yet had a negative experience with law enforcement that would justify their exclusion from a jury for cause. Today, we once again have all-white juries because so few African Americans are deemed fit for jury service. Employment discrimination, absolutely routine. Virtually every job application has that box you got to check asking the dreaded question, Have you ever been convicted of a felony? Doesn't matter if that felony happened 3 weeks ago or 35 years ago. For the rest of your life, you've got to check that box, knowing full well the odds are sky high that application's going straight to the trash. You know, some studies have indicated that as much as 70% of employers won't even consider, won't even read, won't even think about hiring someone who's a drug felon. Never mind that most people violate drug laws in their lifetime, but if you check that box for a drug felony, employer won't even think about hiring you. Hundreds of professional licenses are off limits to people branded felons. Some states you can't even get a license to be a barber or a manicurist if you've been convicted of a felony. Housing discrimination, perfectly legal. In fact, when you're released from prison, you're barred from public housing for a minimum of 5 years. Barred. And your family risks eviction if they allow you to come home and stay with them. What are folks supposed to do? Where are they supposed to go? Discrimination is also perfectly legal in public benefits. In fact, as I mentioned, under federal law, if you're a drug offender, you're deemed ineligible for food stamps for the rest of your life. Now, fortunately, many states have opted out of this federal food ban on food stamps, but still it's the case that thousands of people in the United States, including pregnant women, people with HIV and AIDS, can't even get food stamps because they were once caught with drugs. So what do we expect folks to do? You're released from prison, you can't get a job, you're barred from housing, even food stamps may be off limits to you. Well, apparently what we expect them to do is to pay hundreds or thousands of dollars in fees, fines, court costs, accumulated back child support, which continues to accrue while you're in prison, and then in a growing number of states you're expected to pay back the costs of your imprisonment. And paying back many of these costs and fines may be a condition of probation or parole. And then get this. If you're one of the lucky few who actually manages to get a job, up to 100% of your wages can be garnished to pay back all those fees, fines, court costs, accumulated back child support. What do we expect folks to do? I say, what is the system designed to do? It seems designed to send folks right back to prison, which is what in fact happens about 70% of the time. About 70% of people released from prison are rearrested within 3 years, and the majority of those who return do so in a matter of months because the challenges associated with mere survival are so immense. But we have a name for them: repeat offender, career criminal, people trying to struggle to survive on the outside. Now, most people I've spoken to who have been stuck trying to re-enter tell me that all of that isn't even the worst of it. All those formal legal barriers to political and economic inclusion, it's not even the worst of it. That the worst of it is the shame and stigma that follows you for the rest of your life. The shame and stigma of having to admit, yeah, I'm a felon. I'm a felon. It's the shame and stigma of having to beg your grandma to sleep in her basement at night because nowhere else will take you in. It's that shame and stigma that causes so many people branded felons to try to pass. You know, during the Jim Crow era, light-skinned blacks would try to pass as white to avoid the shame and discrimination associated with race. Well, today, people branded criminals or felons try to pass not just by lying to, employers, by refusing to check the box, or to housing officials, but by lying or denying or avoiding with friends, neighbors, family members. Now, there's an excellent ethnographic study published about this. It was actually published as a book called Doing Time on the Outside. It was a study of neighborhoods hardest hit by mass incarceration in Washington, D.C. I mean, these are neighborhoods where literally every house or every other apartment has a family member who's either currently behind bars or has just been released from prison. I mean, these are neighborhoods where you would think that imprisonment is so normal that just everybody be talking about it all the time, who's in, who's out. They couldn't find one person, not one, in these neighborhoods who had fully come out to their friends, neighbors, loved ones about their own criminal history or that of their loved ones. Children asked, "Where's your daddy?" Say, "Oh, my daddy? Yeah, I don't know where my daddy is. I don't know where he is," knowing full well he's behind bars. People ask, "Oh, where's Troy Jones? Who's Troy Jones? Where's Troy Jones?" "Oh, Troy, yeah, he's out of town. He's out of town." "Oh, he's out of town. When will he be back?" Not sure. It's going to be a while. Hard to say. Not sure." People, when asked by friends, "Oh, where have you been? I haven't seen you in ages. What have you been up to? Where have you been?" "Oh, you know, I've been doing a little this, doing a little that. I can't talk now. Gotta go." That shame and stigma keeps our communities divided, shaming and blaming one another, and it also leads to a collective silence that makes collective political action next to impossible. So what do? Where do we go from here? Well, I firmly believe that nothing short of a major social movement has any hope of ending mass incarceration in America. Now, many people think that this economic crisis is going to save us, that the economic crisis is going to force prisons to downsize because we can no longer maintain such an expensive prison system and still keep our schools open and our roads paved, and that this is going to lead to the end of mass incarceration. And there will be some downsizing of our prison system in the years to come, but we will not get back to where we were without a major social movement. If we were to go back to the rates of incarceration we had in the 1970s, before the war on drugs and the Get Tough movement gained full steam, we would have to release 4 out of 5 people who are in prison today. 4 out of 5. More than 1 million people employed by the criminal justice system would lose their jobs. Most new prison construction has occurred in predominantly white rural communities, already economically vulnerable, desperate for jobs. Many of these communities have been promised great benefits associated with prison construction, and many of those promises have not lived up. But those communities have now become dependent on prisons, part of their economic base. Prison guard unions, like here in California, prison guard unions have become among the largest and most powerful political organizations in the country. Those prison guard unions, those folks would have to just walk off the job. Private prison companies now listed on the New York Stock Exchange would be forced to watch their profits just poof, vanish. This system is now so deeply rooted in our social, political, and economic structure that it is not going down without a major fight, a major upheaval, a drastic shift in our public consciousness. So how do we get this movement started? What do? Well, the first thing I think we've got to do is to start telling the truth, the whole truth. We've got to start admitting out loud that we as a nation have managed to recreate a caste-like system. We've got to start educating ourselves and each other, dispelling the myths about this system, and understanding the harm that is done to our communities, ensuring that all those in our family, all those in our church, all those in our schools understand the harm that has been done and why. And then we've got to start ending this stigma and shame and blame associated with criminality and people returning home from prison. We're all criminals, all of us, every last one of us. You haven't reached adulthood if you haven't broken the law at some point. You drank underage, or you experimented with drugs, or if the worst thing you've ever done in your unadventurous life is speed 10 miles over the speed limit on the freeway, you've put yourself and others at more risk of harm than someone smoking marijuana in the privacy of their living room. but there are people doing life sentences in the United States for first-time drug offenses. The U.S. Supreme Court in Harlan versus Michigan upheld life sentences for relatively minor first-time drug offenses, saying it doesn't ban it doesn't violate the 8th Amendment ban on cruel and unusual punishments, even though virtually no other country in the world does such a thing. So we've got to end this sense of us versus them, the criminals and then the law-abiding citizens. We've all broken the law. We've all made mistakes. We're all sinners. We've all stumbled in our lives. Some of us have gotten caught. Some of us have not. Some of us have been relegated to a permanent second-class status, and others of us, like Barack Obama, who was admitted to a lot of drug use in his life, managed to escape the caste system and become president of the United States. But if he had grown up in the hood, if he hadn't been insulated by being raised by white grandparents in Hawaii and attending predominantly white universities, if he had come up like an ordinary kid in the hood, he would have been stopped, he would have been searched, he would have been swept into the system. He might not even have the right to vote today, much less be president of the United States. So we got to start ending the shame and blame and create safe places in our communities, our churches, for people to admit their own criminality out loud and get the help and support they need and deserve. And then we've got to get to work organizing to end the war on drugs, 3 strikes laws, mandatory minimum sentences. My last chapter has a laundry list of all the work that needs to be done, ending unjust forms of discrimination against people released from prison that keep them trapped in a second-class status for life. And we've got to be committed to building a movement that is multiracial and multi-ethnic. It includes poor whites. You know, this drug war was born with black folks in mind, but it has hurt and destroyed the lives of people and communities of all colors. Latinos have become a primary target of the drug war in many states. There are white folks in prison who desperately need drug treatment but are getting a prison cell instead. So this drug war and this system is harming people and communities of all colors, and we've got to be willing to connect the dots and build a multi-racial, multi-ethnic movement for human rights in the United States. But before this movement even gets started, a great awakening is required. We've got to awaken from our colorblind slumber to the realities of race in America. And we've got to be willing to embrace those labeled criminals. Not necessarily all their behavior, but them, their humanness. For it has been the refusal and failure to recognize the dignity and humanity of all people that has been a sturdy foundation for every caste system that has ever existed in the United States or anywhere else in the world. No, it's our task, I firmly believe, to end not just mass incarceration, but to end this history and cycle of caste in America. So thank you very much, and I look forward.
Thank you, Dr. Alexander. Thank you very much for coming here and awakening us. This is what we needed. We will take questions. You need to line up at the 2 microphones here. I would just like to give you the rules of engagement. Please ask a question. Do not pontificate, and I know what it is because I do it all the time. So please ask a question, because we'll take questions. Please line up and we'll take them as they come.
Yes.
Thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation, just chock full of excellent information, and I actually have read your book. My question, I'm trying to remember if you addressed this in the book. You talked about ways that the power structure is incentivized to maintain this corrupt system. But one of the things I wanted to ask you, which is related to disenfranchisement, and that is, for those prisoners who are in prison, are there some states, or maybe even at the federal level, that count their numbers so that those districts, if you, do you want to talk to that?
Yes, yes. It's kind of the modern day version of the 3/5 clause. Under Census Bureau rules for the last few decades, prisoners have been counted in the district in which they're held in prison rather than as members of their home community. And now what does this mean? It means that the counties, districts that house prisons, predominantly white rural counties, get increased representatives in state legislatures or in Congress. They're counted as having more people in their district, even though those people can't vote. They're counted as having more people, and those districts gain political power, while the communities from which the prisoners came lose representatives, lose political power. So these folks are counted, and what I view as, the equivalent of the 3/5 clause, being counted but unable to vote and not really viewed as a human being.
I read some information that there's been a study done on the reading level of 3rd and 4th graders, and also the high school dropout rate to determine how many prisons will be built. And I want to know, are you familiar with any of that, or
Yes.
can you share information regarding that?
Yes, it's true. There have been a couple of states where it's been reported that states project their future prison population based on the reading scores of 3rd graders or 4th graders. And this has led, understandably, many people to believe that the single most important thing that can be done to reduce the size of the prison population is to make sure that our kids can read. Now, I agree 100% that we have got to do everything in our power to increase literacy rates and improve our schools. But I think it's a mistake to believe that we have got to fix our schools in order to end mass incarceration. We've got to fix our schools because it's the right thing to do. But poverty and lack of education did not cause mass incarceration. Black folks have been poor and uneducated for a very, very long time. We've never had incarceration rates like this. Now, what has led to these high incarceration rates are high arrest rates. If we stop arresting people en masse for relatively minor drug offenses that occur with roughly equal frequency in middle-class white communities on college campuses, we stop doing that, we will reduce our prison population dramatically, reduce the rates that people are cycling in and out of prison dramatically, even without fixing the educational system. If we started stopping and frisking white kids in their neighborhoods on their way to school, on their way home, sweeping fraternity houses, all that, we would see a huge spike. We'd see a huge spike in the numbers of white folks who are in prison today. So it's not just that education, prevents white folks, middle class or wealthier, privileged people from going to prison. It's that they're treated differently by law enforcement. A war hasn't been declared against them. So we do have to prove, our educational system. And I want to point out that when it comes to violent crime, and I don't spend a lot of time talking in the book about violent crime because violent crime has not driven mass incarceration, and I think most people assume that it is, and, it's not true. Violent crime has not driven mass incarceration. But we ought to be committed to reducing or eliminating violent crime in our communities. And in this wonderful book called When Work Disappears, it describes how, the racial disparities in violent crime disappear when you control for joblessness. So for example, if you compare white jobless men with black jobless men, there's no racial disparity in violent crime. jobless men are more likely to be violent. It's not an excuse, but the reality is that jobless men are far more likely to be violent than working men. And if we want to reduce violence in our communities, the most important thing we could do is put people to work. And improving our educational system and creating job opportunities is the #1 violent crime prevention program that we could adopt. And so, fixing our educational system, investing in jobs is absolutely critically important to reducing crime, but we can end mass incarceration by ending our practice of rounding people up in mass and warehousing them unnecessarily.
Yes, my concern it basically involved rap music and the pants hanging. And in regards, what I'm speaking of is regarding the whole thought of many people, persons singing rap music and related to drugs or crimes or criminals. And now you see in white society and others, they're singing so much rap music, and the pants are hanging down as well. You can go to the best of schools or whatever in Orange County, and you see their pants are hanging.
What's your question?
So my question is, in regards to what you're speaking of, was the caste system, in regards to African Americans, in regards to others concerning the rap music and the pants hanging, and the correlation that is, they're doing it as well. How are we still thinking along the way of crime and criminal and drugs and that kind of thing? Has that changed any, or is there any conversation in your book concerning those two issues?
I just want to make sure I understand your question. Conversation about the relationship between kind of gangster culture or hip-hop culture.
Right, and the pants hanging, and now, everybody, I won't say everybody's doing it, but many of the kids are doing it in the very fluent areas as well.
Right. Well, I do talk in, I think it's the 4th chapter of the book, about the fact that many people will say, how can you say that, young kids of color are stigmatized by being branded criminals or felons when so many of them are bragging about it? Or loving gangster rap, or mimicking prison issue, jumpsuits by having their pants sagging and all of that. How can you say that they're stigmatized by it when they seem to be embracing it? And what I cite in the book is the psychological literature that shows that when people feel that they cannot escape a fate or a stigma, they embrace it. So, for example, queer pride is an attempt to embrace a stigma. Black is beautiful is an attempt to say, you say black is bad, I say black is beautiful. So when you see young kids saying, I'm a gangster, yeah, I'm in prison, they're embracing what they see as an inevitable reality in their lives. You say I'm nothing but a criminal? Yeah, I'm a criminal. Now, of course, the problem is that while embracing your stigma can be a very, effective coping mechanism when you're stigmatized severely, saying black is beautiful doesn't harm anybody. Saying, you're proud to be gay doesn't harm anybody. But saying, I'm proud to be a gangster, that is a problem. That is destructive. And so we have got to help our young people, resist the stigma that they've been saddled with in ways that are more healthy. A lot of times I think adults go around telling kids, pull up your pants, don't talk like that, lecturing a lot about why they should kind of cope better with their current reality. I think we need to encourage folks to be in resistance, but do so in a way that serves their community rather than destroys it. So I say, be a freedom fighter. Fight on behalf of your people and resist the system, but don't claim to be a gangster and engage in behavior that will destroy yourself and your community. So I hope that answers your question.
Just to let you know, no one else should get in line. We have about 15 minutes. We'll get as many questions in as possible, so please ask a question. Quickly.
Did I understand you to say that under the Bill Clinton administration that the drug war escalated?
Yes.
My question is there a correlation between that and also the fact that he did not sign the child care legislation, and that was the break between Bill, Hillary, Marian Wright Edelman, and Peter, her husband? Would you speak to that? Was there a correlation, a relationship between those two situations?
Yes, I believe there was, and I don't know the history of that legislation well enough to describe it in any detail, but it is no doubt that during that period of time, that Bill Clinton and the other so-called New Democrats were committed to demonstrating that they were going to be tough on poor folks of color, and that they were going to distance themselves from anything that seemed soft or seemed like social welfare or giving people a helping hand or a handout. And that was all part of the Southern strategy. And it played out when Clinton committed himself to end welfare as we know it, as well as to rev up the drug war. It was all part and parcel of the same political strategy that Democrats felt they needed to pursue in order to win back a particular block of voters.
So would you say in regards...
No follow-up question.
Okay.
Next person.
Okay.
My question is, since you've identified drugs as a problem, correctly so I think, do you favor the legalization of marijuana and cocaine?
Well, I certainly favor the legalization of marijuana. I think that's a no-brainer. I mean, the harms associated with criminalizing people, putting them in prison, saddling them with criminal records that will follow them for the rest of their lives, those harms so greatly outweigh the potential harm of the drug itself. And the violence associated with marijuana is not caused by the drug itself, it's caused by its prohibition. So, if we want to have a sane drug policy, I think it would be to treat marijuana like, alcohol and other, drugs that have been legalized and regulated. I mean, I believe marijuana should be regulated. I don't want to see it in the grocery store. But it doesn't have to be in the grocery store to be legal, and it's possible to develop systems of regulation that won't wind up criminalizing generations of people and spending, billions of dollars that could otherwise be channeled to just about any other more productive use. Now, when it comes to other drugs, I actually believe that the time is overdue for us to have a conversation about decriminalization and legalization of other drugs. We should put it on the table. We should put it on the table and be willing to ask ourselves that question. We've spent $1 trillion, with a T, $1 trillion on the drug war. Had virtually no effect on drug addiction or drug abuse. So, the time is overdue to ask ourselves, is this working? And perhaps it's time to shift from, a criminal punishment model to a public health model for dealing with drug abuse, drug addiction. And so we should at least begin to have that conversation. Portugal just reported its results of its 10-year experiment with decriminalization of all drugs. If you're caught with any kind of drug in Portugal, you're not doing prison time, period. And the New York Times has reported it. You can get information about it, but they had incredible success. Rates of drug abuse and addiction declined. More money was channeled to drug treatment. There are other models out there that have worked far better than the one we've pursued. So it's a conversation it's overdue.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments. My question is, in this community, Pasadena, and there's a lot of leadership here, the police chief is here, the mayor was here, you talk about organizing. Well, in 1982, the police department had to integrate, and in 70, the school district had to integrate, so we're aware of that. So what specifically type of organizing are you talking about as we as a community could do to try to stop the plague in our community? I can't think about everybody else, but in Pasadena, what can we do specifically to organize?
Well, I think, as I said, I really think the first and most critical step is to really engage in an aggressive public education and consciousness raising campaign. There are so many myths about this system that, lead people to kind of accept the status quo and feel resigned to it. And so it's really about holding forums like this one, making sure every church, has a conversation about these issues and begins to talk about them openly, and that this gets into our schools, that a conversation is held in our schools, that there is a growing awareness about the true nature of the system and the harm that's done. And then I say you got to get to work organizing, and it doesn't matter so much which issue you pick. There's a long list of issues. It can be legalization of marijuana. It could be banning the box on employment applications. It can be, a long list. You take your pick of the issue that you want to begin with. It's the way we do our organizing that matters. If you engage in policy reform and treat, that isolated policy as just one policy that needs to be fixed in an otherwise, pretty reasonable system, then we're just going to keep spinning our wheels and engaging in piecemeal policy reform, for the foreseeable future. But instead, if when we're organizing to ban the box on employment applications, if what we say when we're doing that organizing is we're banning this box on employment applications because it is one example of the many ways in which people who are released from prison are locked in a permanent second-class status, are treated as less than human, for the rest of their lives, and that we ought to have more care and compassion and concern and support them as they attempt to re-enter society. This is the one issue we're working on right now, but you make clear that when you're done with that, you're moving on to food stamps, you're moving on to housing, that you are in the process of dismantling a system as a whole. So I say, pick your issue, get started, but make sure that what you say about it and the way you engage in your advocacy sends the message and raises consciousness that a movement is being built to dismantle the system as a whole.
Yes, sir.
I wonder, with doing your research, if you were aware of the work of Michael Rupert or the journalist from the San Jose Mercury News. I can't remember his name. Who wrote Dark Alliance?
Yes, Gary Webb.
Yeah, and yes. And people might not be aware that.
Let's get to a question.
This is the question. That in Afghanistan, since we've been there, the drugs was practically eradicated, and now they're growing more than ever before in their history. And planes are crashing with tons. CIA planes still crashing with tons of cocaine in them. So there's an enemy. There's a conspiracy. How do we get there to put right our justice system?
Well, I'm not, it seems sort of implicit in your question. I think a lot of people assume that if the government really wanted to stop drugs from coming into the country, they could just, shut off the tap and we could
too
prevent
much money in it, Hillary Clinton said.
But actually, I think that if you kind of look closely at the efforts that have been made to shut down the production and importation of drugs, you'll see that most of those efforts have failed. If you shut it down in one country, it pops up in another. As long as there's overwhelming demand in the United States for illegal drugs.
The CIA is the biggest drug dealer, though, in the world.
Yeah, no, I'm just saying. I'm not going to argue about the CIA's role in all of it. I'm just saying that as long as there's demand for illegal drugs in the United States, they will find their way here. And so the answer isn't just to deal with the CIA or pour more money into failed efforts to block the importation of drugs in the United States. We ought to deal with the extraordinary demand for illegal drugs in the United States and choose how we respond to drugs. I'm not saying that we need to forgive or look the other way to the CIA. I'm just saying that it's not as though the government can actually turn off the tap and prevent illegal drugs from flowing into the United States.
The promoter.
Thank you. Next question.
Yes. First of all, I'd like to commend Pasadena Police Chief Sanchez for being here tonight and listening to this. I think that's great. My question is, are there any cities in the United States that have pulled back on aggressively arresting drug offenses? How did they do it, and what organizations have been taking the lead?
I'm sorry, can you say that again? I lost you were speaking fast and I didn't hear.
Sorry.
No,
yes. Any city in the United States that has pulled back on aggressively arresting drugs on drug crimes, how did they do it, and what organizations have been taking the lead in this?
Well, there are examples. There have been a number of cities, and in Massachusetts, for example, has decriminalized marijuana possession. Some of these efforts, though, have had mixed results. For example, you may have heard in the news about how New York City decriminalized marijuana possession, and yet there are still some like 500,000 arrests related to marijuana. How do they manage to pull that off? Well, it's not a crime to possess marijuana, but it's a crime to display it in public. And the police ask you to empty your pockets on a public street, and now you've displayed marijuana and can be subject to arrest. So it's very important that the way these policies are crafted don't allow for those kinds of loopholes. But the Drug Policy Alliance, I believe, has really taken the lead in advocating for drug policies that are sane and more likely to have a public health approach rather than a criminalization approach. So I recommend the Drug Policy Alliance.
Sorry, this is going to be our last question from this young man here.
All right. Well, in the past, the youth has had a big part in creating change in community. So what would you advise the youth to do now? Would it be to aspire to be government officials and create change through the system, or would it be to just start a revolution?
Sounds good if you have a plan, but actually, this is an argument that my husband and I have. My husband's a federal prosecutor. You can imagine the conversations we have in our house. And he firmly believes that a great deal of change can occur from within the system. And that the most important thing is to have people in positions of power who are going to exercise discretion fairly and wisely. I think that it is very unlikely that the scale of change that needs to take place in our system is best accomplished from within. That doesn't mean that there isn't a role for good police and good prosecutors in building this movement. In fact, the more people within law enforcement who have the courage to speak up and speak out, the better. But I think that young people today can make their greatest contribution to movement building and really working on the outside to generate the overwhelming pressure and momentum that's going to be needed to dismantle the system as a whole. So I wish you the best of luck with that.
That will end our question and answer period. There will be a book signing outside at the end. Let's give a warm round of applause for Dr. Alexander and her Awakening of Pasadena.